Malia Obama was excited about her weekend plans. She had been looking forward to spending a relaxing day with her friends in the city. Life had been busy, and she rarely got a chance to enjoy simple moments like this. The group decided to visit a cozy little cafe that was popular for its delicious coffee and pastries. The sun was shining, and the streets were buzzing with energy. As they sat at a corner table, laughing and chatting, Malia felt grateful for the chance to unwind. She kept a low profile, dressed casually in jeans and a jacket, blending in like any other young woman. Most people didn't even notice her, which she appreciated. She wanted to be treated like an ordinary person, not as the daughter of a former U.S. president. After an hour of laughter and stories, Malia decided to step outside for a breath of fresh air. She stood by the cafe entrance, enjoying the warm breeze. Just then, she noticed two police officers walking toward her. She didn't think much of it at first, assuming they were just passing by. But to her surprise, the officers stopped right in front of her. One of them, a tall man with a stern face, asked, "What are you doing here?" His tone was sharp, and it caught Malia off guard. She looked at him calmly and replied, "I'm just standing here, enjoying the day." The second officer, a woman with a curious expression, tilted her head and asked, "Do you have any ID on you?" Malia frowned slightly but remained polite. "I'm not carrying my wallet right now. Is there a problem?" The first officer crossed his arms, looking her up and down. "This area has seen some trouble lately. You seem suspicious standing here alone," he said. Malia was confused. Suspicious? She was just outside a cafe, enjoying the fresh air. More people began to notice the scene, and some even paused to watch. Malia felt her cheeks flush, not with anger but with embarrassment. She knew she had done nothing wrong, yet the officers were treating her like a troublemaker. She took a deep breath and said, "I think there's a misunderstanding. I was just having coffee with my friends inside." The officers didn't seem convinced. Instead, they continued to question her in a way that felt unnecessary and unfair. Malia stayed calm, answering their questions politely, but the tension in the air grew heavier. A few bystanders whispered to each other, recognizing her face. However, the officers didn't seem to notice who she was. Malia glanced at the cafe window, where her friends were watching with worried expressions. She wanted to keep the situation under control, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this was turning into something more than it needed to be. Little did she know, this was just the beginning of an unforgettable day. The situation outside the cafe grew more uncomfortable as the police officers continued to question Malia. She tried her best to remain calm and polite, but their tone was becoming more serious. People passing by began to stop and watch, curious about what was happening. One of the officers, the taller man, asked again, "Why don't you have your ID? If you've done nothing wrong, you should have nothing to hide." Malia took a deep breath and replied calmly, "I didn't think I'd need it for a quick outing to the cafe. My friends are right inside. They can confirm everything." She gestured toward the cafe window, where her friends were watching nervously. Instead of listening, the officers exchanged skeptical glances. The female officer spoke up, her voice softer but still firm. "This area has seen a lot of issues recently, so we need to check on anything unusual. You standing here without ID makes things look suspicious." Malia could feel the stares of the growing crowd. Her heart pounded, but she refused to let her emotions take over. She had always been taught to handle difficult situations with grace. "I understand you're just doing your job," she said gently. "But I promise, I'm not causing any trouble. I was just taking a break outside." Despite her reasonable explanation, the officers didn't back down. Instead, the male officer's tone became even sterner. "If you can't prove who you are, we might have to take you in for questioning." At this, the murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Some bystanders recognized Malia and began to whisper her name. A man standing nearby called out, "That's Malia Obama. Do you know who you're talking to?" The officers paused for a moment, glancing around, but they still didn't seem to believe it. Malia didn't want to cause a scene. She didn't want special treatment because of who her father was, but she also knew this situation wasn't fair. She could feel her friends' eyes on her from the cafe. They looked worried, and one of them seemed to be dialing a phone number. The male officer, clearly not recognizing her name, scoffed and said, "Whoever you are, rules are rules. We can't just let people stand around suspiciously." Malia looked at him calmly, though her hands trembled slightly. "I've been respectful to you, and I've done nothing wrong. I'd appreciate it if you could talk to my friends inside, or even let me call someone to clear this up." Before the officers could respond, a black SUV pulled up to the curb. The car's door opened, and a tall, familiar figure stepped out. The crowd gasped. It was Barack Obama himself, walking toward them with a calm but serious expression. The air seemed to freeze as everyone turned to watch what would happen next. The moment Barack Obama stepped out of the SUV, everything seemed to change. The crowd, which had been quietly watching the scene unfold, suddenly grew silent. Malia's heart skipped a beat as she recognized her father approaching. She had never imagined that her peaceful day would turn into something like this, but now she was thankful that he was there. The officers froze when they saw Barack Obama. The tall officer, who had been questioning Malia so sternly just moments before, looked completely stunned. He quickly stood up straighter, a clear sign of respect, but his face flushed with embarrassment. The female officer beside him shifted nervously on her feet. Barack walked calmly toward them, his gaze focused on the officers. Malia could feel the tension in the air. It was as if the entire city was holding its breath. People had recognized her father, and a few started taking photos, whispering to one another. Some of them even started recording videos on their phones. "Malia, are you okay?" Barack asked, his voice soft but filled with concern. He reached her side, looking down at her with a reassuring smile. Malia nodded quickly, grateful for his presence but still feeling the sting of the situation. "I'm fine, Dad," she said, trying to stay composed. She didn't want her father to think she was upset, even though the whole thing was starting to feel like an unfair attack. The officers seemed to be caught between their duty and the recognition of who had just arrived. The tall officer cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. "Mr. Obama, we didn't realize," he began, but Barack interrupted him before he could finish. "I'm sure you didn't," Barack said calmly, his voice steady. He looked at Malia with a gentle expression before turning back to the officers. "But you should know who you're talking to before you make assumptions. My daughter is not just anyone. She deserves to be treated with respect." The female officer, clearly uncomfortable, nodded quickly. "We apologize for the misunderstanding, sir. We were just trying to do our job." Barack didn't raise his voice, but there was a certain authority in his words that couldn't be ignored. "I understand that," he said, "but you need to remember that being respectful doesn't mean jumping to conclusions. If you're going to question someone, it's important to do it in a way that doesn't make them feel humiliated." Malia stood quietly, watching as her father spoke. He was always so calm, so composed, even in moments like this. She admired how he could handle any situation with such grace. As the crowd began to realize what had just happened, many of them seemed to feel a sense of relief. The tension that had filled the air moments before seemed to dissipate. People started talking to each other again, but they did so in hushed voices, aware of the importance of the moment they had just witnessed. The officers exchanged glances, clearly embarrassed by the situation. "We didn't mean to cause any trouble," the male officer said, his voice quieter now. Barack gave a small nod, acknowledging the apology, but his expression remained serious. "Make sure it doesn't happen again," he said firmly before turning to Malia. "Are you ready to go?" Malia nodded, her heart still racing but feeling relieved. As they walked away, she felt the eyes of the crowd following them. But with her father beside her, she felt safe, knowing that he had her back no matter what. As Barack and Malia walked away from the scene, Malia couldn't shake the feeling of what had just happened. It had started as a simple outing with her friends, but it had turned into something much bigger. Even though her father had come to her rescue, she still felt the sting of the officer's harsh treatment. She had been calm, but inside, Malia was angry. How could they treat her like that? Why had they assumed she was a threat just because she was standing outside a cafe? It didn't seem fair, and she couldn't help but feel humiliated. The truth was, she had always wanted to live her life without the pressure of being constantly recognized as the daughter of the former president. But today had reminded her that her name and her family's legacy would always follow her. Her father had made history, and that was something she couldn't ignore, no matter how much she wanted to. Barack walked beside her, and for a moment, Malia thought about what it must have been like for him, being in the public eye for so many years, always under a microscope. How had he dealt with the constant attention? How did he manage to stay so calm when faced with difficult situations? Malia had always admired her father's ability to handle pressure with such ease. Even now, he seemed completely composed. He didn't show the anger that Malia had felt earlier. Instead, he walked beside her with a quiet confidence, as if nothing had happened at all. "Are you okay?" Barack asked, his voice soft as he glanced at his daughter. Malia nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure if she was. "I'm fine, Dad. Just surprised." Barack smiled gently. "It's understandable. You've never had to deal with something like that before." "No," Malia agreed. "But it doesn't make sense. I didn't do anything wrong." Her father's face grew serious, but his voice was still calm. "I know, and that's the point. People shouldn't jump to conclusions, especially when it comes to someone they don't know. I've been in situations where people made assumptions about me, about our family, because of who we are. But the key is to stay calm, to remember who you are, and to rise above it." Malia thought about his words. Her father had faced so much throughout his life: criticism, judgment, and even hatred. But he had always handled it with grace. It was one of the many reasons why people respected him. "You're right, Dad," she said quietly. "I guess I just expected things to be different for me. I didn't think people would treat me like that." Barack nodded. "I understand. But your name, your heritage, it's a part of you, whether you want it to be or not. It's something you have to live with. But it doesn't define who you are. What defines you is how you respond to situations like this." Malia thought about that for a moment. Her father had a way of turning difficult moments into lessons. It wasn't always easy, but it was a lesson she would carry with her. She didn't have to let other people's assumptions control her. As they continued walking, Malia felt a sense of peace begin to wash over her. The weight of the situation was still there, but she felt stronger now. With her father's words in her mind, she knew that she could face whatever came next. As Barack and Malia made their way back to the car, Malia couldn't stop thinking about the situation. She felt a mix of emotions: frustration, confusion, and even a little embarrassment. It wasn't the kind of attention she had wanted. She had only wanted to enjoy a quiet day with her friends, but now everything had changed. Barack seemed calm, but Malia could tell he was thinking about what had happened too. The tension from the encounter with the officers still hung in the air. As they reached the car, Malia hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Dad, I know you were trying to help, but I didn't want to make a scene," she said, her voice small. "I just wanted to be left alone." Barack turned to her with a soft smile, his eyes filled with understanding. "I know, Malia. I know. But sometimes things happen that we don't expect. And when they do, we have to take a stand." Malia nodded, feeling comforted by her father's words. She had always admired how he handled difficult situations with grace. But this was different. This time, it had been her. And for a brief moment, she had felt completely powerless. Just then, Malia's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, expecting a text from one of her friends, but instead, she saw that it was a call from her mother, Michelle Obama. Malia quickly answered it, her heart still racing from the earlier events. "Hello, sweetie. How are you doing? Michelle's voice came through the phone, full of concern. Malia took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. Hi, Mom. I'm okay. But something happened. It's a long story. Michelle's voice grew more serious. What happened? Are you safe? Malia looked at her father, who was now leaning against the car, watching her. I'm safe, Mom, but the police stopped me while I was outside the cafe. They treated me like I was doing something wrong. They didn't believe who I was, and it felt wrong. Michelle was quiet for a moment, taking in what Malia had said. I'm so sorry you had to go through that, Malia. No one should ever make you feel like that. Malia felt a wave of relief wash over her at her mother's comforting words. She wasn't alone in this. It just felt so unfair, Mom. I didn't even do anything wrong. I know, sweetie, Michelle replied gently. And I'm proud of you for handling it so calmly. But don't ever be afraid to speak up when something isn't right. You're not alone in this, and you have your family and people who care about you. Malia smiled, feeling comforted by her mother's support. She could tell that her parents, though they had both experienced their fair share of challenges in the public eye, were still protective of her and wanted to shield her from things like this. I'll be okay, Mom, Malia said softly. I just wanted you to know what happened. I'm glad you told me, Michelle replied. And don't hesitate to reach out if you need anything. We're here for you. As the call ended, Malia felt a sense of gratitude. Even though the day hadn't gone as planned, she knew she could always count on her family. With their support, she would be able to face whatever came next. As Malia and her father continued their walk toward the car, the tension from the earlier encounter still lingered. Malia couldn't stop thinking about how things had spiraled out of control so quickly. She had hoped for a quiet, uneventful day, but it had turned into something far more complicated. The crowd that had gathered outside the cafe still watched them. Some people were chatting quietly, while others stood frozen, holding their phones and recording the entire scene. Malia felt the weight of their eyes on her, and though she had always known that people would look at her differently because of her family, it still felt uncomfortable. Suddenly, a black SUV pulled up to the curb. The engine purred softly as it stopped, and the crowd began to stir with excitement. People's heads turned, and Malia could hear quiet whispers as the car door swung open. Out of the car stepped Barack Obama, her father. Malia's heart skipped a beat. She had known he would be coming soon, but seeing him walk toward her in that moment gave her a sense of calm. His presence was powerful, and just seeing him made her feel safe. The crowd seemed to recognize him immediately, and the energy in the air shifted. As her father approached, Malia could see the officers standing up straighter. They knew exactly who he was. The tall officer who had been questioning her earlier looked surprised, almost nervous, as Barack walked toward them with a quiet confidence. Malia stood still, watching as the familiar figure of her father moved closer. He didn't look angry, but there was an undeniable seriousness in his expression. He was always calm, but when necessary, his voice could carry the weight of authority. Malia, are you okay? Barack asked, his voice soft and filled with concern. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his gaze scanning the situation. Malia nodded, trying to calm the nerves that had been building since the encounter had started. I'm fine, Dad, Malia said, trying to sound reassuring, though she still felt shaken. Barack turned to the officers, his demeanor calm but firm. What's going on here? He asked, his voice steady and controlled. The officers exchanged awkward glances. The tall officer who had spoken to Malia earlier stammered slightly. Mr. Obama, we didn't realize who she was. We were just doing our job. Barack's expression remained serious. I understand that you're doing your job, but when you're questioning someone, you need to be respectful. No one should feel humiliated, especially not my daughter. The female officer lowered her head, clearly embarrassed. We're sorry for the misunderstanding. Sir, she said quietly. Barack nodded but didn't smile. Mistakes happen. But remember this, everyone deserves respect, no matter who they are. You have to approach situations like this with care. Malia stood quietly beside her father, feeling a mix of relief and pride. Even in a situation that could have been very tense, Barak handled it with grace. His calm words seemed to diffuse the tension that had been building. Malia couldn't help but admire how he always seemed to know exactly what to say. The officers apologized again, and after a moment, they turned and walked away, their heads down. Malia could see that they understood the mistake they had made. She didn't need to say anything more, because her father had said everything that needed to be said. As they walked away from the scene, Malia couldn't help but feel grateful. Today had been unexpected and uncomfortable, but with her father's support, she felt like she could handle whatever came next. As Barak and Malia made their way back to the car, the bustling noise of the city seemed to fade behind them. The tension that had filled the air only moments before began to settle, but Malia couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted in her. The day had been full of surprises, and she still felt a little shaken by how quickly things had gone wrong. But now, with her father by her side, she felt a little more at ease. The car door closed softly behind them, and Malia sank into the seat, staring out of the window. The world outside seemed peaceful, almost normal again, but she couldn't forget the way the officers had treated her earlier. They had assumed the worst without reason, and it had hurt her more than she had expected. Barak, sitting next to her, could tell she was still thinking about the encounter. He turned to her, his voice gentle but firm. "Malia, I know that wasn't easy. I want you to understand that what happened today isn't your fault. You didn't deserve to be treated that way." Malia nodded, but she didn't say anything. She had always known that her father had a way of seeing things clearly, even when situations seemed unclear. His calm perspective was something she admired, but it didn't make her feel any less upset. "There's something important I want you to remember," Barak continued. "People make mistakes, and sometimes they don't treat others the way they should. But when that happens, it's important to hold them accountable." Malia looked at her father, surprised by what he said. "You mean, like what you did with the officers?" Barak nodded. "Exactly. They made a mistake, and I needed to help them see it. When someone's actions hurt another person, it's important for them to understand what went wrong. And it's important for you to speak up and let them know when something's not right." Malia thought about his words for a moment. She had seen her father do this many times before. He had faced criticism, unfair treatment, and even hatred, but he had always responded with dignity. He had never been afraid to speak out for what was right, no matter how difficult it was. "I guess I've seen you do it before," Malia said softly. "But it's hard to know when to speak up. I didn't want to make a scene today." Barak smiled gently. "It's understandable. No one likes confrontation, but standing up for yourself and for others is important. It's part of being accountable, not just for your actions, but for the actions of others too." Malia thought about how, in that moment, her father had taken a stand, not just for her, but for the idea that no one should be treated unfairly. It was a powerful lesson, and one she would carry with her. She realized that accountability wasn't just about pointing out mistakes. It was about making sure people understood the impact of their actions and learning from them. As they continued their ride through the city, Malia felt a new sense of strength. The incident outside the cafe had shaken her, but it had also taught her something important. She wasn't just a passive observer of the world. She could be an active participant in making it better. "Thanks, Dad," Malia said, her voice soft but sincere. "I think I get it now." Barak smiled warmly. "Anytime, Malia. I'm always here to help." And as they drove off, Malia felt more confident in her ability to handle whatever came her way. The rest of the day passed quietly, but Malia couldn't stop thinking about everything that had happened. It felt like her life had been turned upside down in just a few hours. She had gone from enjoying a peaceful outing with friends to feeling humiliated by strangers who had treated her unfairly. But even in the midst of that chaos, Malia was starting to feel a sense of clarity. Her father had helped her see things differently. He had shown her that even when people make mistakes, there's always room for understanding and growth. She had seen him handle difficult situations with such calm and wisdom, and now she was beginning to understand the power of forgiveness and redemption. Later that evening, as Malia sat at home reflecting on the day, she thought about the officers who had treated her so harshly. They had apologized, but that didn't erase the way she had felt in the moment. Still, she knew that holding on to anger wouldn't help. What mattered was how they responded after the incident. They had shown remorse, and that was a step in the right direction. She remembered her father's words, "Everyone deserves respect, no matter who they are. You have to approach situations like this with care." His message had stuck with her. It wasn't about getting back at someone or seeking revenge. It was about learning from the experience and moving forward. As Malia sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through her phone, she saw that several news outlets had already picked up the story. Videos from the incident outside the cafe were being shared online, and the conversation had started to spread. Some people were commenting on how the officers had treated her, while others were praising her father for stepping in to help. Malia sighed, feeling a mix of emotions. She had never wanted to be the center of attention, especially not for something like this. But as the comments continued to pour in, she realized that the story was starting to spark a larger conversation. People were talking about the importance of respect, empathy, and accountability, values that her father had always stood for. The next morning, Malia woke up to a call from one of her friends who had seen the news. "Hey Malia, I just wanted to check on you. Are you okay? I saw the video, and I just wanted to say that I'm really sorry you had to go through that." Malia smiled as she heard the concern in her friend's voice. "Thanks, I'm doing okay. It's been a crazy 24 hours, but I'm fine now. I've learned a lot from it." Her friend sounded relieved. "I'm glad to hear that. Honestly, you handled it way better than I would have." Malia laughed softly. "It wasn't easy, but I had help. My dad gave me some great advice. He always knows the right thing to say." As Malia hung up the phone, she felt a sense of pride. Her father had been her rock, guiding her through a tough situation with wisdom and strength. But she also knew that she had learned something important on her own. She had learned to stand tall in the face of unfairness, to speak up when necessary, and to forgive when people showed they were willing to change. The experience had changed her, but in a way that was empowering. Malia now understood that no matter what happened, she could always rise above it with grace and strength. As the days passed, Malia found herself reflecting more on what had happened. The incident with the police officers, though uncomfortable and unfair, had become a defining moment for her. She had learned a lot about herself, about her family, and about how to handle life's challenges with strength and grace. It wasn't easy, though. In the days following the incident, there were still moments when Malia felt the weight of what had happened. She could see people whispering when she walked into a room, and sometimes she overheard comments about the video that had gone viral. Some people were kind, offering support and sympathy, while others had made assumptions about her. But Malia didn't let it drag her down. She had learned from her father's example that it was important to focus on the bigger picture, not just the small, uncomfortable moments. It was about how she responded, how she handled herself when things weren't going as planned. And she knew that the best way to move forward was to keep living her life with confidence and purpose. One afternoon, Malia sat down to write in her journal, something she had always found helpful when sorting through her thoughts. She wrote about the incident, about how it had made her feel, and about the lessons she had learned. She also wrote about her dad's words, how he had taught her the importance of standing up for herself and for others, no matter the situation. She thought about how her family had always been there for her, especially in moments like this. Her father's calm presence had been a source of strength, and her mother's words of encouragement had reminded her that she wasn't alone. Malia realized that no matter what happened, she always had her family by her side, supporting her and helping her become a better person. As she closed her journal, Malia felt a sense of peace. She wasn't going to let one difficult day define her. Instead, she was going to use it as a stepping stone to grow even stronger. The world could be unpredictable, and there would always be challenges to face. But Malia knew she had the strength to meet those challenges head-on, just like her father had done many times before. A few weeks later, Malia decided to speak out about her experience. She wanted to share her story, not to seek sympathy or attention, but to remind others that no one should ever be treated unfairly, no matter who they were. She knew that speaking up could make a difference. She could be part of the change that she wanted to see in the world. Her story became a conversation starter, and people reached out to thank her for sharing her experience. Malia realized that by being open about what had happened, she was helping to create a better understanding of how important it was to treat others with kindness and respect. The incident with the officers, though painful, had pushed Malia to be more vocal about the issues that mattered to her. It had helped her discover her voice and her ability to stand up for what was right, no matter the circumstances. And as she looked toward the future, Malia knew that the lessons she had learned would stay with her forever. She had emerged from the experience stronger, more confident, and ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. She wasn't just the daughter of Barack Obama. She was Malia Obama, a young woman with her own voice and her own purpose. And that was enough.